Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this special edition of Defense News Weekly from the Navy League Sea Air Space Exposition outside Washington, we're looking at the future of the Navy, both on and above the waves. We'll also hear directly from the Navy's Acquisition Chief and the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, with in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis. This is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm Jeff Martin here in National Harbor, Maryland, at the Navy League Sea Air Space Exposition. We've heard a lot this week about the future of the Navy and the new technology that will equip it. Our studio here at the show has been busy, so let's show you what we heard. Up first, I talked to both Rob Levinson and Cameron Luthi with Bloomberg Government about the Trump administration's flip-flop over retiring the carrier Harry S. Truman. Our discussion centered around what happens now and how it will be paid for.
If Congress and the President are deciding we're going to keep the Truman, well, then that means more aircraft. And you know, again, that
was going to be my next
cascades
question.
to the.
Walk me through you guys' reaction to this flip-flop that we had on the way, because there's no other way to call it. The White House proposes it in their budget, decommissioning the Truman, and then comes back and says we're not going to decommission the Truman. It's our gift to you from the Vice President. What was going through you guys' mind when you're seeing that?
When we saw it, I think when it first came out, you know, everybody kind of knew that Congress was going to push back hard on that.
Your colleagues were voicing skepticism.
Everybody was. We were all about. No way Congress is going to retire a carrier.
Yeah, and that's fine that Congress and now the President has said, okay, we're not going to do that. But that's $3.5 billion now that somebody's got to come up with somewhere.
Yeah.
So you know, there's no magic place to get this money. And again, it's not just the aircraft carrier; it's the sailors, it's the aircraft that go on the aircraft carrier. So where does all that come from? You know, the Navy's now got to scramble to figure that out.
Another neat thing we saw this week was Raytheon's Spy-6 radar, which is the next generation of Aegis radars. It was on display outside the show, so I went out to check it out. Here's my report. So one of the biggest things that people are seeing here at Sea Air Space 2019 is this radar you see behind me from Raytheon. So I'm here with Scott Spence from Raytheon to talk to me about this. So Scott, what am I seeing behind me?
So this is the Spy-6 radar, the Navy's next generation air and missile defense radar. This is one face of the four-face system that'll go on the new Flight 3 destroyers.
So what's different about this face than the face I currently see on current Navy destroyers out in the field? So walk me through some of the differences here.
So this is an entirely digital radar. You see on the back of this radar how clean it is. There's no additional waveguide or anything. That radar, the information comes off that radar, is digitized and goes right into the back-end processing in the combat management system.
So what's that do for sailors? Does that reduce their maintenance workload that they have to worry about?
So much easier to maintain. There's only two tools needed to maintain that radar. Also, much higher reliability as well. So when you have to maintain it, it's two tools, but you don't have to maintain it that often.
So what am I seeing here? Is this one whole side of what we would?
This is one face. Really, for Spy-6 for the destroyers, there's really four radars that one radar goes on each face, and they get integrated together, but they all work independently. So that gives a lot more flexibility to the fleet when they deploy this.
And so with Spy-6, you guys have had a lot of advancements in the past couple of months. Walk me through some of the program milestones here.
Well, we just finished in January our last ballistic missile test, the most complex target yet. We tracked that ballistic missile throughout its flight. That concluded our testing out at PMRF test facility. We just awarded three more ships for the Flight 3s, and the ESA program, the Enterprise Air Surveillance Program, which is a smaller variant of the exact same technology. We just delivered that down to Wallops Island for its testing this past March, and that'll complete this year.
So there's another thing that we've heard a lot about with this program is kind of the retrofitting the Navy's looking to do to take the Spy-6 technology onto older ships. What's that going to look like?
So it's exact same technology, just a little smaller footprint. So about 24 RMAs versus 37 RMAs. That fits into the Flight 2A ships, meets their power, weight, and cooling requirements of those ships, and then you put the same technology. Because
that was going to be but I guess for power generation and everything like that, you need that.
There's less power generation, less cooling on those platforms, so we'll size the radar to that. Still gives quite a bit of capability. It'll give Spy plus 15 dB capability to those Flight 2As. That was the original requirement for the Flight 3 ships. So we're actually going to be able to deliver the Flight 3 requirements to Flight 2A ships.
If I'm a radar operator sitting on an Aegis ship right now and I'm looking at a difference between the Spy 1 picture and the Spy 6 picture, What's the difference there? What's the for the user interface for all of that?
So this radar is 100 times more sensitive than the current Spy-1 radars. It's going to see much more information much further away. It's going to give the warfighter a lot longer time to react to those incoming missiles, those incoming threats, be able to make a decision on how to interact with those.
So that gives them a lot, and also the back-end workload. They're not going to have to work as hard to maintain a radar like this as they were with the older ones.
Quite a bit less maintenance. The back end, besides only 2 tools here, all the back end processing is all commercial processing technology that's common today for the maintenance of the radar.
And so finally, looking ahead to kind of the rest of 2019 and early 20, what can we expect from the program?
So the ESA program will complete its testing and it will start production later this year. We anticipate long lead material award for that program in the early summer timeframe, and that'll kick that off, and then we'll continue to get ready to deliver these to the first Flight 3. We're actually delivering hardware down to Huntington Ingalls the end of this week for the below deck equipment for the first destroyer.
That's a big deal. How's that feel?
It's great. It's been about 10 years of hard work by a great team, both the Navy and Raytheon, and we're really excited about delivering this capability.
All right, Scott, thanks for the time. I really do appreciate it.
Okay. I appreciate you coming by. Thank you.
Another high-profile program right now is the development of the Boeing Block 3 FA-18 Super Hornet, which will be the backbone of the carrier air wing for years to come. Here's an update on how that work is going with Boeing's Jen Tebow.
It is a really exciting time to be on the Super Hornet program. We were just awarded multi-year 4, which includes 78 Block 3 Super Hornets, which is a really big deal for the program, big deal for the Navy, and a big deal for St. Louis. So the Block 3 Super Hornet is quite an upgrade from the Block 2. It includes 5 major enhancements, one being conformal fuel tanks, where we're putting conformal fuel tanks on the top of the airplane, basically the equivalent of 2 tanks of gas, but putting them on the top so that they can less drag, they can go further, and then frees up some weapon stations. It includes an advanced cockpit system, which takes the old, smaller legacy displays and puts them into one big piece of glass for the pilot's touchscreen. It also includes some radar cross-section enhancements, so adding to the already good survivability of the Block 2 Super Hornet, but just buying ourselves some more margin and survivability there. It includes a 10,000-hour airframe, so the current Block 2s are at a 6,000-hour airframe and are going into our service life modification production system, which will be converted to 10,000 hours. The Block 3 Super Hornet will roll off the production line as a 10,000-hour airframe.
And when do you expect to kind of roll off the first one right now?
The first full-up Block 3 will come off of the production line end of 2020, and we have accelerated the development of the Block 3 1 year, and in fact are delivering 2 test jets to the Navy end of this year. We're already building both of those in our factory today, and that will allow the Navy to test the advanced cockpit system and get it carrier qualified, as well as the 5th piece of Block 3 that I didn't mention earlier, which was the advanced networking infrastructure. So it includes TT&T data link, a low latency, high bandwidth data link, as well as a DTPN processor. It's an adjunct processor that's open to be able to add capability and apps, if you will, onto the jet, making it flexible and adaptable for the future. And it also includes a SATCOM antenna.
So from the pilot's perspective, looking at coming from what they're going to be coming from Block 2 Super Hornets to these Block 3s, what's really from their perspective, is it going to be a difficult transition in y'all's mind, or how much training do you think might be needed?
So far, feedback from the aircrew that have seen it in the sim, and we just flew the advanced cockpit system for the first time last month. So it's going into the Kuwaiti jets, and we flew the production version of that. Feedback has been really great. The pilots love the large area display, so anytime you can get them more situational awareness and more flexibility of the information that they see, the better. Block 3 will also bring enhanced fusion and the ability to do more of what we call common tactical picture and fusing all the battle space together to provide better decision aids for the pilot to offload the work that they have to do in the cockpit. The transition over time should be pretty seamless. The initial implementation of the large area display will basically replicate what the pilot sees today, only in a touchscreen fashion. So there will be a small training program involved in that, but we don't anticipate anything but positivity coming out of that.
And moving a little bit, so like the U.S. sale, you guys are in great shape there with the U.S. Navy and everything like that. But foreign side, there's a lot of potential there. What can you share there?
The Block 3, I think, really re-perked interest in the international community. So we'll be building Block 3s well into calendar year 2023. So, you know, strong, alive production line, and now we've seen interest from multiple countries. So, you know, I think the outlook looks really good. I'm not going to speculate, you know, on exactly what decisions are going to be made, but, you know, there's a number of campaigns going on that we're excited about.
As the Navy is developing what its future ships will look like, it's sometimes worth looking to the decisions that influenced the last major ship design cycle. So David Larder sat down with the recently retired Navy Captain Mark Vandruff to get his take on the trade-offs in ship design.
Future ship design is going to be different than the way they designed DDG, the program that you ran. DDG was about packing a lot of things densely into a very survivable ship. And of course we saw, you know, tragically in 2017 and in previous incidents, how survivable that ship actually is. Future design is going to be different. As you've sort of looked at, without giving away the farm on the programs you've been working, you've been advising on, if you could sort of walk us through some of the trades that you're looking at now and some of the things that are going to drive the design considerations in the future.
So let's go back and do a little history as an example point. Let's take one of the most successful ship designs the U.S. Navy ever produced, the Iowa-class battleship. And I would say it's successful because we used it in over a span of 50 years and over a span of many different concepts and of war, and war changed and the nature of technology changed, and yet still the battleships with modification found themselves relevant from the early 40s all the way into the early 90s. But the battleships were very survivable. They were extremely hard to modernize. They were not what we would now call a flexible platform, because you took all of the really good stuff and you buried it inside feet, in some cases, or inches of really strong armor, which was great. It made it really, protected it from damage. But if you wanted to swap something out, you had a real engineering problem on your hands. And I can tell you, if the battleships were more flexible, if I could have pulled out the boilers and put in gas turbines, we might still have them today. But the lack of flexibility then is something that you trade for that great survivability. Fast forward a couple of generations of ship, and now you're in the late 70s, early 80s doing a design for what will someday replace the Charles F. Adams destroyers, what we now know of as the DDG-51 class. And again, we took all the most vital computer systems and we put it in the hardest places to get at, so that if the ship were ever to take damage, it would retain as much of its core capability as possible. And now you mentioned the tragic accidents with McCain and Fitzgerald. It wasn't damage mechanism from an enemy missile or from an enemy gunfire, but a 40,000-ton merchant ship hitting you T-bone, that's a tremendous damage mechanism, and yet Fitzgerald got back to Japan under her own power, and for most of that transit had a fair amount of combat capability still resident in the ship. Now the trade-off of that is, again, all of those things that you've now buried deep in the ship, put lots of structure around, if I want to rip them out, that makes getting it out and making it different harder. If you look at the other spectrum of that, you could wear your combat system as an exoskeleton, which some would say was part of the charm of a LCS mission module, and you get a lot of effectiveness in theory out of an LCS mission module, but you're on the other end of that survivability to reconfigurability scale. The important thing for the acquisition community to do is to understand that and to provide the requirements makers good options and to provide them good science. And then ultimately, it's up for the requirement setters, the people who represent the warfighter. In the Navy, that's done by the CNO staff. It's up to them to make those trades and say, okay, what do I value more in this situation? And you covered a talk I gave at ASNI last year. I made the observation that going forward, where we put that marker on the scale given where technology is going, I don't think we ever give up survivability, but in the survivability, reconfigurability, flexibility continuum, that pointer might move a notch or two towards flexibility as being a greater value for warship performance in what's going to be the 21st century.
And to keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also, be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. And when we come back, we'll sit down with the Navy's Acquisition Chief and the Commandant of the Coast Guard. One big thing the Navy is planning on spending money on is work to upgrade older cruisers and destroyers to keep them on par with new ships being built. So to find out more, David Larder talked with the Navy's Acquisition Chief, James Geurtz.
The issue with updating the destroyers and the cruisers has always been how expensive it is. Right. So, and now that you're looking at no DDGs left behind and updating as many of them and bringing them out as long as you can to meet this goal of a fleet size with the capacity to meet all the requirements that the Navy has around the world, that has made a big difference, and it seems that it has the potential anyway to make a big difference. Can you talk a little bit about the digital twinning effort, I guess, in the modernization world, and how you see it might drive design going forward?
Yeah, I think to your point, it may be one of the most fundamental things we've done over the last 18 months since I've gotten here. And for the audience, a digital twin is how to, in the destroyer case, one of our most complex weapon systems in the Navy is the Aegis combat system. We have now been able to virtualize that in about a Pelican case worth of hardware and software. And so if you think forward, now you could have your certified combat system on the ship, through OT, ready to go fight. You could have your next system in test on the ship, being tested as you're operating in the fleet. You could have your third system with a bunch of weird and wacky algorithms, doing AI kinds of things, all on one single ship, and that can fundamentally change how we approach things. And to show you how, a few weeks ago, we took a virtualized Aegis combat system on an old destroyer, hooked it to the sensor, shot a missile, and hit a target. And so, we think this is going to be a pathway not only to really revolutionize how fast we can modernize our current systems, but then kind of keep up with things. There's an old, I think it's an old Eisenhower saying, if you can't solve a problem, make the problem harder. Right, and so, if we make the problem so hard that we've got only a week to update systems, not a year, then I think it will drive us to some of these new concepts.
And obviously there's a security element to that too. I mean, some of the pushback whenever I write about this in the comments section is, for example, this drive towards a single combat system and digital twins is the cybersecurity aspect of it. And I'm wondering, as you have, and this is not just in this specific case, but across a broad spectrum of efforts inside your community, there are concerns about cybersecurity, and there's obviously been that Wall Street Journal report recently about subcontractors being under siege. How are you addressing that as things get more networked and more technical? Yeah,
so absolutely cyber is a concern, and it's something we've got to address stem to stern through the enterprise, and really bring security back as one of our fundamental things we think about when we put acquisition strategy together. Having said that, I would actually argue digital twin, being able to upload 24 hours from compiling to combat, all give you a lot more resiliency because you can update your systems faster. As you find vulnerabilities, you can deal with them faster. If I can have 3 versions of the combat system on the ship and one gets corrupted, I can immediately deal with that. So I actually see it as a means to add resiliency, not as a vulnerability. Obviously, we've got to think our way through it. The other thing, we're seeing digital twin on more than just combat system. We're now building digital twins of our shipyards. So how do we improve the efficiency of how we repair ships? And looking at, okay, let's look at the whole shipyard. Let's model it, let's simulate it, let's figure out where there's efficiencies. So I think you're going to see that continue to kind of cross all the different domains in the Navy.
And when we come back, we'll hear from the Commandant of the Coast Guard about the funding problems facing his service. On this week's Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack offers her latest tips.
Last year, more than 40 million used cars were sold in the U.S., and Edmunds research says this year's numbers will be even higher. It also sounds like the market is great for buying a used car. Even though car buying has become easier online, before you hit the internet or the dealership, you still need to prep for your purchase. You have to be able to afford the entire car experience, not just the monthly payment. That means gas, maintenance, insurance, taxes, and registration. If you're still a go for the car lot, it's time to make sure you're buying a reliable car for a great value. That's where online services like Carfax come in. To know if you're paying the right price for the right car, you got to know the car's history, because at least one person owned the car before you did. So when you're shopping for your loan, go with a lender that will offer free access to a Carfax history report. Once you found the right car, get pre-approved so you're in control of negotiations and you can easily stick to your budget. It's a great time to get a good deal on a used car. Use these tips to get you behind the wheel of the right car at the right price.
And thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more defense news coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our early bird brief, delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And when we come back, we'll hear from the Commandant of the Coast Guard about the funding problems facing his service. During the government shutdown earlier this year, one of the most visible effects was the lack of funding for the U.S. Coast Guard. Since then, the service's Commandant has been public about the need to change how the Coast Guard is funded. Here's part of our chat on the topic. Sir, thanks for taking the time to chat with us here today. So I know the Coast Guard's had some challenges recently. The shutdown did not go well for the service at all and everything. What are you guys doing to kind of recover from that?
Well, Jeff, yeah, the shutdown was a shutdown, and obviously going 35 days without pay was tough on our members. You know, not having appropriations challenged us from a readiness standpoint. You know, I think we have recovered, come out of the shutdown here, you know, as we head into hurricane season, which on the calendar kicks off on 1 June. You know, the nation's Coast Guard's ready to go. We'll be a full up ready contingency force. You know, some of the things like boat maintenance periods, dry dock availabilities, we lost some calendar days on that. That's tough. But I would tell you, going forward, the Coast Guard's ready, back in the saddle, and ready to do the nation's business here.
And you've been up on the Hill recently doing your testimony and talking about the budget. What's the number one message you're trying to get through to lawmakers about the problems that the shutdown caused?
Yeah, well, I'll be honest with you. The conversations on the Hill, you know, the members of Congress talk about the shutdown. I've been on the same message since I did my, you know, Hill visits before my confirmation hearing. You know, this is April 2018. The Coast Guard's challenge is readiness. You know, we have been in a budget environment on the operating support, O&S, you know, what DoD calls O&M operating budgets. We've been flatlined for a good part of eight plus years here. So as the President rolled out a conversation about National Security Presidential Memo number 1, the readiness of the armed forces, and good, and it's fantastic and good for DoD. They got about a 12% bump in 2018. Being in DHS, we weren't part of that conversation. You know, the White House has supported us, Polar Security Cutter, that is huge. We're off to the races here, but we are a capital-intensive organization like the other armed forces, and we got some bills there. We've got some maintenance we've been kicking the can on. So since before I even assumed the duties of Commandant on 1 June 2018, I've been having this conversation about the readiness of the Coast Guard, and I've testified recently about being at a readiness tipping point. You know, we just need to enhance the understanding of the fact that, you know, it's a readiness conversation that we need to take ownership of, and I need to convince folks to say this is important for the nation for a ready Coast Guard.
When it comes to that issue you brought forward there of the pushing forward readiness of the armed forces, but the Coast Guard not being part of that because they're DHS, was that a communications problem of not just acknowledging the Coast Guard as a military service in a lot of the public eye, or is that a very fundamental statutory problem that needs to be fixed?
Well, I would say, you know, I think the Coast Guard sitting in DHS is the absolute right place. You know, we're a military service. You know, arguably you could say put us in DoD, but I think because of the nature of our 11 statutory missions, DHS is the right place. We're a border security agency, a law enforcement agency, we're a regulatory agency that regulates, you know, waterways, commerce, things like that. You got an ant that goes on a cruise, that ship needs to be environmentally compliant when it comes to U.S. safety, all those types of things. So DHS is the right place. I just think sometimes what has changed in this post-sequestered environment is, you know, we used to have a conversation from a funding standpoint about security and non-security. When it's a security conversation, the Coast Guard was in that. DHS was in that conversation. Now it's a defense, non-defense conversation. Not being in DoD, we're not part of that defense conversation. So we get left a bit on the sideline there, but we're an armed force. That's what's unique there. I think it's about heightening the awareness, making sure folks understand that, you know, the legislators, the overseers in Congress, make sure the administration understands that.
And so looking at the Coast Guard of today, 2019, versus the Coast Guard of, say, 2020 and moving forward, what do you need? What does the Coast Guard need to be able to do all the missions that it needs and not have ships breaking down and aircraft falling out of the sky?
Yeah, so the first order of business I say to our folks that do mission support, they're doing an awesome job of keeping, we've got a fleet of 14, 50 plus year old 210s and a fleet of 30 plus year, you know, a fleet of 13 30, 35-year-old 270s, they're going to be replaced by offshore patrol cutters. We just started cutting steel on those at Eastern Shipbuilding Group in January. We need to maintain momentum on putting new capabilities in our people's hands, and we need to raise the bar on readiness. That money that pays to recruit, develop, and retain, a world-class Coast Guard workforce. These young men and women in an environment where there's 3.5% unemployment, they're smart. And the Coast Guard, if we bring folks in, and I'm trying to broaden the diversity organization, I'm trying to raise our number of women, I'm trying to raise our number of underrepresented minorities, they look around and they say, is the Coast Guard valuing me? Is the Coast Guard an inclusive organization? That's where operating dollars are absolutely the competitive edge or not. So the conversation I'm having is about being an employer choice, making sure a Coast Guard man or woman sees himself being successful in the organization, being valued. And that's why we've got to talk about readiness, we've got to talk about operating and support dollars.
That's all we have time for from the Navy League Sea Air Space Exposition outside Washington. To read more, be sure to visit our digital show daily at defensenews.com. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.